15 minutes. That is reportedly how long a Northern Kentucky jury deliberated before acquitting McKinley Hardwick for killing a man named Elmer Dick. Hardwick did not arrive at that trial, supported only by relatives, friends, or neighbors. Traveling from Pulaski County to testify were judges, a sheriff, a court clerk, a county clerk, and a county attorney. A remarkable delegation of public authority stood behind him. But another person had also been shot during the killing for which Hardwick was standing trial. His estranged wife, Rosella. She survived that first shooting. 15 years later, she would not survive the second. And McKinley Hardwick would again admit that he had fired the shots. This story raises an uncomfortable question, one that has echoed through courtrooms and communities for generations. When a well-connected man or woman enters the courtroom surrounded by influence, reputation, and respected officials, who is standing in the other corner for the victim, especially the victims, for whatever reason, who are unable to speak for themselves? We need to be clear about what the surviving records do and do not show. They certainly don't prove that officials worked together to sway the jury. And they certainly don't prove that a witness was threatened or that anyone interfered with the proceedings. Character witnesses were allowed to speak on Hardwick's behalf, and the jurors had the responsibility of weighing that testimony alongside the other evidence. Their verdict was theirs to reach. But the surviving record does not tell us what happened in the jury room, which testimony carried the most weight, or why they ultimately chose to acquit him the first time. But history does not require us to ignore the social power that entered that courtroom. From the records we found, Hardwick was at the very least a veteran and a night watchman. Old newspaper clippings show he was reportedly active as an officer in the American Legion. He knew local police officers and public officials and even assisted in arrests. To a modern reader, it can look very similar to what we might call a good old boy system, a network where a man's community connections could speak loudly. But before we examine what happened in the courtroom, we need to return to the beginning and follow the events that led there. In the summer of 1929, McKinley Hardwick was a 26-year-old farmer living near Zion in Pulaski County. His wife's name was Rosella. The couple had 2 young children. Newspapers reported that their marriage had been troubled for months. After another argument in August, McKinley and Rosella agreed to separate. He brought her to Somerset and purchased a railroad ticket so she could travel north and look for work. Rosella left Pulaski County, but McKinley soon followed her. The newspaper said he intended to persuade her to come home. By August 17th, Rosella had found a room in Covington. She visited the home of Louise Price to speak about employment. Also in the Price house was Elmer Dick, a Southern Railway fireman who had once lived near them. Dick and Rosella were seated together on a trunk when McKinley Hardwick entered. Hardwick confronted Dick, then drew a revolver. He fired 4 times at Elmer Dick. Every bullet struck him. Rosella dropped to the floor. Hardwick then, reportedly, turned the revolver toward his wife. Almost immediately, Hardwick lifted his critically wounded wife and began driving south. While Northern Kentucky officers searched for him, he transported Rosella 80 miles to a hospital in Lexington. He left her there and went to the office of Pulaski County Judge R.C. Tarter to surrender. Deputy Sheriff Ralph Eller was directed to return him to Covington. Hardwick claimed that Elmer Dick had become involved with his wife. His attorney said he had evidence of an intimate relationship, but Rosella told a very different story from her hospital bed. She denied having an improper relationship. She said her husband knew there had been nothing between them. She declared that she intended to prosecute McKinley. When the Kenton Circuit Court trial began in Covington in June 1930, Hardwick arrived with an extraordinary group of character witnesses from Pulaski County. Among them were very familiar names for the time: Judge R.C. Tarter, Sheriff Tully Sears, the county attorney, the circuit and county clerks, physicians, and a prominent businessman. The prosecution asked for the death penalty. The defense claimed Hardwick had been temporarily insane. Then, once the testimony was said and done, the jury retired to deliberate. Less than 15 minutes later, it returned. McKinley Hardwick was acquitted of killing Elmer Dick. The record does not tell us why. What we do know is that Hardwick walked away a free man after killing a railroad fireman and gravely wounding his wife. Nearly 15 years passed, and by 1944 we find McKinley and Rosella living on the east end of Somerset. They had divorced a year earlier, but McKinley had persuaded her to let him stay in a separate room in the house she shared with their daughters. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1944, gunfire erupted again, this time inside the May Street home. At 10:30 that morning, McKinley drove to Somerset City Hall, which would have been at most a 2 to 3 minute drive. He, then, rushed into what was called the police courtroom and told patrolmen Robert Warren and Alfred Williams, quote, "We've had some trouble out at the house," and asked them to accompany him. When the officers arrived, they found Rosella on her back, in the floor, arms outstretched, with multiple gunshot wounds. A .32 caliber pistol, fully loaded, within a foot of her right hand. There were signs of life, but barely. The men drove Rosella to Dr. Wall's home, but it was too late. She died only moments later. Judge R.C. Tarter, the same character witness from 15 years prior, was notified and went to the home to conduct an inquest. The similarities are disturbing. In both, Hardwick shot Rosella. In both, he sought out authorities. And in both, he offered a legal explanation to excuse what he had done. In the first case, he claimed temporary insanity. The second time, he said it was self-defense. This time, though, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The 12-year sentence did not last. He served around 2. Governor Willis reduced his sentence to 5 years, and with parole, he was a free man. Hardwick's explanation of Rosella's death was the one that survived in the official clemency report. Rosella's voice, her statements from that 1929 hospital bed, were absent, as far as we could find. According to a gubernatorial order reported in the Commonwealth, Hardwick had provided what was described as invaluable service during a state investigation involving the prison institution. The newspaper did not explain exactly what Hardwick had done. It reported only that his cooperation had assisted an official inquiry conducted during the previous year. The governor also cited Hardwick's prison record. But there was another factor. The order stated that numerous Pulaski County officials and citizens believed the 12-year sentence was excessive. Once again, people from Hardwick's home community had intervened on his behalf, and the governor reduced his sentence from 12 years to 5 years, making him immediately eligible for parole. This story is not only about 2 shootings. It is about whose reputation a community protects. It is about what happens when a man's status places influential people on his side. Could Rosella's death have been prevented? The records cannot answer that. But after all these years, it is a question Pulaski County's history prompts us to ask. We cannot say with certainty that a conviction in 1930 would have prevented her death in 1944. Too many what-ifs. But one thing can be said, and that is that accountability changes circumstances. Was this a good old boy system at work? There is no documented proof that Pulaski County officials influenced the first jury to acquit Hardwick. There is no proof that the officials and citizens who later supported a sentence reduction acted with corrupt intent. The governor had the lawful authority to reduce a sentence. However, influence often works through reputation, access, personal relationships, social standing, and the willingness of respected people to speak on someone's behalf. Rosella appears to have had no such network comparable to McKinley Hardwick. Did she trust that the authorities would protect her? Did she believe that leaving again might place her in even greater danger? 15 minutes, and 15 years later, it seems like an obvious answer. At nearly every stage, Hardwick had someone willing to speak for his character, explain his actions, or argue that his punishment was too severe. Rosella's voice appears only briefly in the records we found. Even today, when public officials speak, in any medium, their titles travel with their words. What may appear to be a personal comment carries weight that can help, influence, or damage. That is why officials must use their voices and station carefully. Thank you to one of our friends and followers who reached out to us about this story and asked us to take a look. This episode is dedicated to a woman very dear to our hearts, a woman whose name recently became a headline after experiencing circumstances painfully similar to Rosella's, and in recognition of anyone who has had to fight to be heard or believed or thought that things would get better. Thanks for watching.